The nation rose to its feet, applauding. AOC cameras zoomed in. National broadcast. The spotlight found her. The woman hailed as the unfiltered voice of a restless generation. Thunderous applause erupted, not just in the hearing room, but across living rooms, comment sections, and crowded cafes. AOC had just delivered a speech like a sharpened blade, fierce, eloquent, and by all accounts, untouchable. She thought she had won. And then, a single sound cut through the noise. The soft, deliberate flick of paper. From across the table, Senator Kennedy, still and unreadable, reached into his folder and pulled out a thin, white envelope. A letter, just one page. But as he began to read, the air in the room froze. The nation stopped breathing. No one saw it coming. No one was ready for what it revealed. That letter didn't just catch AOC off guard. It shattered assumptions, reversed narratives, and forced a question no one wanted to ask. In a world where truth is buried beneath performance, who has the courage to unearth it? Knowing the price might be everything. What you're about to hear is a dramatized story. It didn't happen, but the emotions it stirs, the questions it raises, and the truths it reflects are all painfully real. In politics, where every word is a weapon and every silence a calculation, we believe stories like this don't just entertain. They challenge us to think. What does real representation look like when the lights go off and from the moment you stepped in, you could tell? This wasn't going to be another dull, procedural debate about energy grids and carbon credits. The hearing chamber was packed wall to wall, but not with citizens. With watchers, movers, spin doctors, people who didn't come to listen, they came to catch fire. A dozen camera crews lined the back, jostling for tripod space. Microphones bristled like thorns over every chair. The glare of studio-grade lights bounced off every polished desk and nameplate. Producers whispered into earpieces. News Chiron writers pre-typed potential headlines, not waiting for context, just the moment. Climate activists stood at the back with handmade signs. Not banners for the room, but thumbnails for the internet. Planet or profit, one read. Another, we can't breathe carbon. Behind them, lobbyists in dark suits checked their watches, then their phones, then their clients' donations. One staffer muttered, "This isn't a hearing. This is a countdown." And then the door opened. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez entered like a spark walks into a gas chamber. Quiet at first, then instantly electrifying. She didn't carry a stack of documents or a PowerPoint presentation. She held just one slim folder, bright red, no label, no markings, just pressure. It was the kind of folder you only open when the facts don't speak. They shout. She didn't glance around. She didn't wave to the cameras. She walked like she had already seen the end of the hearing and was just walking backward through time to meet it. Her heels didn't click. They struck. Every step deliberate, unapologetic, like punctuation in a sentence she had already written. At her table, aides tried to brief her. She didn't need it. She leaned in and whispered only once. "Let them underestimate. I'll do the math in blood." She meant it metaphorically, but somehow everyone nearby felt their pulse quicken. Across the aisle, Senator John Kennedy watched her take her seat. He didn't look rattled. He looked curious, a man who'd seen enough storms to know that not every thunderclap ends in rain. He adjusted his glasses slowly, tapped his notepad once, said nothing. But the tension between them, it wasn't political, it was elemental. Everyone in the room could feel it, something unsaid charging the air, as if the confrontation had already begun before a single word was spoken, and no one knew where the blow would land first. A Capitol Hill intern nudged her colleague and whispered, "Are we allowed to film this?" Her colleague replied without blinking, "History's not asking for permission today." And history didn't wait. The chair called the hearing to order, a gavel strike, sharp, hollow, like a warning. This was a hearing about the transition away from fossil fuels. But everyone knew it wasn't really about solar panels or wind credits. It was about power. Who held it? Who felt forgotten by it? And who was finally brave enough to name it? The moderator welcomed opening remarks. The floor turned green. AOC reached for her mic. For a split second, even the air seemed to hold its breath. She began not with pleasantries, not with stats, not even with outrage, but with something colder, sharper, more surgical. When disaster strikes your home, you don't form a committee. You grab your kids and run. Climate change is that fire. And this chamber, it's still arguing over who lit the match. A few gasps, a few smirks, a lot of clenching jaws. She continued, voice steady, eyes unmoving. This isn't policy delay anymore. It's legislative cowardice in a burning house. And the cost isn't numbers. It's names the folder opened. Just once. She read from it like a surgeon reading a diagnosis the patient already feared. Heat waves killing seniors, floods leveling low-income housing, cancer clusters around old coal plants. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. By the time she looked up, even the lobbyists had stopped scrolling. Then finally, she turned to face Kennedy directly. Her tone didn't change, but her words sharpened. And if defending the fossil industry means defending the silence around their victims, then I won't be the one holding my tongue. The room didn't move. Not yet. Kennedy still hadn't spoken. And that's when everyone realized. The next sentence might not be an argument. It might be the match. She didn't come to negotiate. The mic light glowed green, and without a flicker of hesitation, AOC leaned in. Spine straight, voice low and lethal. This isn't debate. It's delay dressed up in decorum. No opening pleasantries. No soft landings. She came with words that struck like lightning, direct, hot, and dangerously close to setting the room ablaze. Every word landed like a countdown. You call it transition, but people are dying while you posture. You call it dialogue. I call it disaster management, after the fires already burned the poor off the map. Gasps. One aide near the press section stopped typing mid-sentence. The climate signs in the back stopped waving. Even the lobbyists at the rear stopped their whispered side bets and leaned in. AOC wasn't speaking to them. Not really. She was speaking for someone else. For those not in the room. For the people whose homes flood without warning and whose lungs choke without protest. For those whose children carry inhalers like lunchboxes because deregulated air is all they've ever breathed. And then she named names, not just companies. She named campaign donors, named CEOs. She didn't say some oil interests. She said people who buy politicians to keep pipelines bleeding. Her voice never rose, but the words sharpened. We lost power grids in Texas, not because wind failed, but because profit did. Because someone somewhere decided that regulation was more dangerous than frostbite. A man in a tailored suit shifted in his seat, eyes scanning the exits. One reporter mouthed, "Did she just go there?" Another whispered, "She passed there 5 sentences ago." And then she turned, not subtly, fully. She faced Senator John Kennedy like a spotlight shifts before the curtain drops. Her tone didn't change, but the temperature did. And if we're being honest, and I intend to be, there are people in this room who'd rather see the planet burn than lose a speaking slot at a fossil fuel summit. Kennedy's hand stayed folded, but one eyebrow lifted, just slightly. And then she said it. The line. The spark. Sit down, boy. The planet's burning. Not bargaining. The words hit with the force of a slap, but the calmness of a courtroom verdict. No shouting, no scream. Just 6 syllables that cracked the air like thunder behind stained glass. A pause swept the room. Not hesitation, recalibration. Because the line wasn't just sharp, it was chosen, targeted, loaded with history, heat, and hierarchy. You could feel the oxygen leave the chamber. No one breathed. Even the staffers who supported her stiffened, not because they disagreed, but because they knew this moment was now out of their hands. This wasn't soundbite territory anymore. It was history, viral, volatile, and uncontainable. A camera zoomed in on Kennedy's face. He blinked. Once. But his expression didn't crack. He didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, the room began to react for him. A low ripple of stunned murmurs. Some disapproval, some awe, some shocked delight. Phones were already out. Clips were already being trimmed for Twitter. Hashtags were being born in real time. Hashtag sit down boy was seconds away from trending. But AOC, she didn't flinch. Because she knew exactly what she had done. She didn't say it to be liked. She said it to draw a line between what politics has tolerated and what she no longer would. But underneath the fire was the fight for something far more vulnerable. She wasn't lashing out. She was reaching out to the people who had no microphone, who had watched hearings like these for years and never heard anyone speak like this. Unapologetic, angry, and strategic in her fury. This wasn't just rhetoric, it was emotional indictment. Because in her world, climate justice wasn't policy. It was survival. It was the difference between schools with clean air and funeral homes filling up after a heat wave. It was generational. It was racial. It was economic. And it was being drowned in decorum. So no, she didn't regret the line. Not in the moment. Not yet. But across the aisle, Kennedy finally leaned forward. He hadn't moved an inch until now. His fingers brushed the edge of a leather folder. He glanced at it once, then lifted his eyes to hers. No smirk, no fury, just calm, quiet, dangerous. He was going to answer, but not with a comeback, with a strategy. And the moment his mic turned green, the room would belong to him. For now, though, the last word belonged to her, and it echoed long after she stopped speaking. The chamber didn't erupt. It froze, like someone had opened a door in the middle of a storm, and all the heat rushed out. You could hear a chair creak, the tap of a fingernail against a metal water bottle. Somewhere in the gallery, a press aide dropped their pen, and it sounded like a gunshot. One gasp, sharp and uncontained, came from a young intern who clearly hadn't been warned that a congressional hearing could feel like a courtroom climax. But Kennedy didn't respond, not immediately. He didn't shift, didn't clear his throat. He simply folded his hands over the edge of the table like a pastor before a prayer. His gaze didn't waver. He looked straight at her, not with aggression, not even with offense, but with something far more unsettling, intention. And when he finally did speak, it wasn't a comeback, it was a correction. I may speak slower, ma'am, but don't confuse that with stupidity. There was no applause, no counterpunch, just silence, heavy and exact. The kind that makes people straighten their backs, not because they agree, but because they feel the weight of what was just said. And it was in that precise second that something cracked beneath the surface of the hearing. Not just the narrative, the balance. Until now, AOC had been the storm. Fierce, righteous, electrified. Every word from her mouth had the urgency of a last warning before the flood. But Kennedy, he brought in something different. Stillness. And that stillness had teeth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't throw her words back. He didn't match heat with heat. He cooled the room with clarity, and that was the moment people leaned forward. One political analyst watching the live stream would later tweet, "The real danger isn't anger, it's restraint." And Kennedy just proved it. But back in the room, what mattered most was what didn't happen. AOC didn't interrupt. She didn't fire back. For once she listened, and that made the silence ring louder. Because in that pause, everyone was suddenly aware of what this wasn't. It wasn't a hearing anymore. It wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning between two very different kinds of power. One, loud, carried by a generation raised on urgency, injustice, and the need to fight back or be erased. The other, quiet, shaped by years in power, comfortable in discomfort, wielding composure like a blade. Kennedy slowly reached into the folder before him. Not rushed, not rehearsed. He paused. Let his fingers rest on a folded page. He didn't pull it out yet, not yet. Because what he had just done didn't need a document. It stood alone, like a stone dropped into deep water. He looked back at the moderator, then returned to AOC. I wasn't raised to talk over people, he said, voice steady. I was taught to outlast them. No one breathed. AOC tilted her head slightly. It wasn't mockery. It was assessment. Like a boxer feeling, for the first time, someone who could take the punch and keep walking forward. And that was new. Because she wasn't used to this kind of response. Not a man shouting her down, not a partisan lecture, but a man who understood that sometimes volume is a trap. And Kennedy had just stepped over it. The press pool jolted into action. Tweets flew. AOC goes viral for sit-down boy moment was already drafted. But what people were actually watching now, what they couldn't stop replaying, was his response. The line, the look, the silence after. Because that silence said something. It said, you don't win the room by shouting the loudest. You win it when your opponent realizes she's not just being watched, she's being measured. And AOC felt it. Not shame, not regret, but awareness. She hadn't lost the crowd, not yet, but she no longer controlled it. And the danger in that wasn't personal. It was strategic, because if she didn't shift, now, the hearing would no longer be about climate, or policy, or justice. It would be about tone. And that's a game she didn't come here to play. Across from her, Kennedy exhaled, barely, and tapped the folded letter once more. He still hadn't opened it, but everyone in the room sensed it already. Whatever was in that letter would not be numbers or graphs. It wouldn't be abstract. It would have a name, a job, a life. And when he read it, it wouldn't feel like debate. It would feel like a verdict. And in that brief, suspended moment, with one sentence and no performance, he'd rewritten the rules of the hearing. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't adjust his tone. He just opened the folder. No theatrics, no grand gesture. Just the slow, deliberate motion of fingers unfolding a letter that had already traveled farther than most people in the room ever would. A letter with creases that told its own story. Not from a legal office, but from a lunch counter, from a cafeteria, from a woman who, until this moment, no one in Washington had ever quoted by name. Senator Kennedy glanced at the heading, nodded once, almost like asking permission, and began to read. My name is Gloria. I've worked at the same public school cafeteria in Lake Charles for 19 years. The voice that carried those words was calm, even soft. But in a room trained to hear volume as power, the softness hit harder, like someone whispering a truth you were too proud to hear shouted. When my husband lost his job at the refinery last year, they told us retraining would come soon, that he could apply for a green energy program, but the nearest one is 3 hours away. We only have one car, and I need it for work. AOC sat still. She didn't blink, but there was something different in her posture now. Not retreat, not guilt, but recalibration. She understood what Kennedy was doing. He wasn't just challenging her politics. He was inviting her into his people's pain. We were told help was coming, Kennedy continued, voice unwavering. But all we got was silence. No one moved. A staffer in the corner dropped their phone, didn't even pick it up. A cameraman steadied his shot, even though there was nothing to pan to. The drama wasn't in the faces. It was in the space between the sentences. Kennedy paused, folded the letter with reverence, and set it down on the desk like it was a family photo. He didn't look at AOC. He looked beyond her, to the press, the aides, the chamber itself. Gloria's not a lobbyist. She doesn't run a PAC. She didn't write this for drama. She wrote it because she doesn't know if anyone here even remembers she exists. He let the sentence land, because the silence afterward wasn't absence. It was echo. AOC breathed in through her nose, controlled, composed. The line about cowardice in a burning house still hung in the air behind her, but now it meant something it hadn't expected. A name, a story, a cost. And Kennedy wasn't done. We talk about transition like it's a slogan, he said, gaze narrowing slightly. But for people like Gloria, it's not a future. It's a cliff. He turned back to AOC. Not confrontational, not cruel. You call it progress. They call it loss. And if we can't reconcile those two truths in this room, then no amount of windmills or solar panels is going to save what matters most. His words were velvet-wrapped razors. Soft delivery, sharp intent. And they did what no statistic could. They made the problem human. AOC finally responded, but not in the way the room expected. She didn't strike back. She didn't pivot into charts. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, and said, Senator Kennedy, no one here is trying to forget Gloria. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was rooted, focused, clear. Climate justice isn't about numbers. It's about not leaving people like her behind. And if that letter means we need to adjust how we're moving forward, then I'm listening. That last line changed the air because it wasn't concession, it was clarity. And clarity, in politics, is as rare as courage. Kennedy nodded. No smile, just acknowledgement. But the message was clear. This wasn't just theater anymore. It was a pivot point. From outrage to ownership, from sound bites to substance, from sit down, boy, to stand up, Gloria. And the public? The public was watching. Not for blood, not for points, but for truth. Somewhere outside the chamber, in a Louisiana kitchen, a woman named Gloria was probably washing dishes, unaware her letter was changing the tone of Capitol Hill. But in this room, her words had already done what no viral clip could. They reminded everyone that behind every policy is a person. And in that moment, no matter how loud the headline screamed, it was the quiet letter that rewrote the temperature of the hearing. She didn't flinch. She could have softened. She could have smiled politely, pivoted to sympathy, even offered a gentle nod to Gloria's letter. That would have been the safe move, the politically sound one. But Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hadn't come to Washington to be safe. She came to make people uncomfortable with the truth they've been trained to ignore. So she leaned forward, not in defiance but in determination. The silence in the room was thick, but she sliced through it with a single sentence. We've had 50 years to fix this, and you're worried about tone? There was no mistaking her intent. This wasn't a walkback. It was a reframing, a reminder that while Gloria's story mattered, so did the thousands like her and the millions at the mercy of rising tides and policy paralysis. You want to talk about waiting for the right language? Stanford just released a study last quarter. It projects sea level rise will displace over 13 million Americans by 2050. That's not tone, that's math, that's bodies, that's homes underwater while we debate whose voice sounds more polite. She didn't blink, didn't breathe between thoughts. Her delivery was rapid, not rushed, like she'd been waiting her entire political life for someone to finally try to pin her power to her pitch. Yale's climate lab found a direct correlation between zip codes with higher poverty rates and the lack of federal climate mitigation funding. Translation? If you're poor, your air is dirtier, your water's warmer, and your recovery time is non-existent. The room shifted, slightly. One aide scribbled something and underlined it. A lobbyist crossed their legs again. Not a full turn, but a twitch, a signal. She was landing blows. And yet, no one clapped. They listened, not with enthusiasm, but with weight, because she wasn't giving them sound bites. She was giving them shame, packaged in statistics. I read Gloria's letter, and I hear it. But let's not pretend this hearing was about Gloria until 5 minutes ago. You didn't open with her. You opened with skepticism. You opened with doubt. And now you're using her pain to question our urgency? She caught herself. Not emotionally, strategically. She slowed, just a hair. Look, I want Gloria to have a job, a future, a just transition. But how do I explain to a flooded-out community in Miami or a wildfire family in California that we delayed action because some senators wanted better phrasing in the legislation? That hit harder than any statistic, because it was no longer about parties or posturing. It was about the gap between what people endure and what power allows. This isn't about yelling. This isn't about civility. This is about a system that keeps asking the oppressed to whisper while the planet screams. That line made a reporter sit up straighter. AOC's eyes scanned the room, not to seek approval, but to challenge silence. She could feel the weight of Kennedy's calm, still sitting there, still collected. But now it was her voice that carried the edge, not sharp from emotion, but honed by repetition, because she'd done this before, in committee rooms where she was the youngest, on networks where her name was reduced to a meme, in meetings where they smiled but didn't listen. And now, finally, they were listening. We're not here to bury fossil fuel workers. We're here to bury the excuse that nothing can change because everything's too complicated. I will not apologize for using urgency when the people paying the highest price don't have the privilege of waiting for gradual. There it was again. That line between passion and precision. She never crossed it. She walked it like a wire. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. But this time, his fingers stopped tapping the edge of the desk. Because even he knew. This wasn't a tantrum. It was testimony. AOC closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with focus. You said earlier that you represent names, families, real people. So do I. And I won't ask them to drown quietly just to make this room more comfortable. That line didn't just hit, it lingered. No one in the gallery moved, because AOC hadn't attacked Kennedy. She hadn't insulted his restraint. She had reclaimed the space between fury and fact, and filled it with the reason she ran for office in the first place. Not to shout, but to shake. And in that moment, for all the silence that came before, it was her voice the room couldn't stop hearing. Kennedy didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask for the floor. He simply waited. And when the moderator gave it back to him, just a slight nod, barely a pause, he leaned forward. Slow, intentional. Like he was stepping into a place that wasn't built for theater, but for accountability. Then came the question. What's the name of the welder you're retraining? Silence. Not because the question was complicated, but because it was precise. Not what's your plan, not what's your party say, but who, what name, what life. He didn't stop there. Where's his mortgage payment coming from next month when the refinery closes and the retraining program still hasn't launched? You could feel the gravity of those words, the weight of asking real questions in a room used to floating answers. AOC blinked, just once. It wasn't panic. It was processing, reorienting. Because this wasn't the usual partisan volley. This was the kind of question that comes from someone who didn't show up to argue ideology, but to defend someone who signed a loan with calloused hands and thought their job would outlive the decade. She sat straighter, opened her mouth, and paused. A beat too long. For the first time, AOC wasn't steering the hearing. She was responding to it. We've allocated billions for just transition programs, she began. The Inflation Reduction Act. Kennedy cut in, gently but firmly. That's funding, not groceries. His tone wasn't mocking, it was measured, surgical, and it cut in a different way. Not to hurt, but to open something. You say this is a moral emergency, and I don't disagree. But when did urgency mean skipping the blueprint? That sentence hung in the air, because it didn't sound like obstruction. It sounded like experience. He wasn't arguing against transition. He was arguing against leaving people behind in its wake. AOC took a breath, this time deeper. Her reply shifted. No longer the rapid-fire barrage of citations. No longer the thunder of outrage. We're working with agencies to accelerate rollout. Some pilot sites are live, others are... Kennedy raised his hand slightly, not to interrupt, but to narrow the lens. Tell me about Joe, from West Texas, 58, laid off in April. No degree, no broadband, no backup plan. You're asking him to wait. For what? Hope wrapped in policy? And that hit, because even her aides looked down. The hearing wasn't turning against her. It was turning toward him. Not because he was right about everything, but because he was asking what most politicians never dare to. What happens in the space between the idea and the implementation? And it was that space, that dangerous, quiet, invisible gap, where families fell through. AOC closed her folder, not in retreat, in reset. No one should fall between those cracks, she said. And maybe that means we need more than ambition. Maybe it means we need deadlines, guarantees, language that makes promises not optional. The room shifted again, this time toward her. Because this wasn't surrender. This was strategy meeting humility. She wasn't losing the argument. She was evolving it. And for the first time, Kennedy didn't push further. He nodded, slow, respectful, like two people stepping onto the same bridge from opposite ends. But for everyone watching, the press, the aides, the country, something had changed. Not in the volume, not in the party lines, but in the emotional gravity of the room. Because for months, the climate debate had been numbers, charts, angles. And now it had a face, a name, a mortgage, and AOC. She stopped citing justice for a moment and started listening to pain. And that was the moment the room turned. Senator Kennedy didn't reach for a new document. He reached for clarity. From his folder, he pulled out a copy of AOC's climate legislation. It wasn't pristine. It had been read, annotated, folded once, and smoothed flat again. Yellow highlighter slashed through key phrases. One of them circled, twice. Section 4, B. He didn't hold it up. He didn't flash it to the cameras. He just opened it quietly and read, slowly, deliberately, like each word was a door he wanted the room to walk through. Federal support shall be provided for displaced fossil fuel workers where appropriate and feasible. Then, without looking up, he asked the question that would break the floor open. Who decides what's appropriate? He let it land. Then, softer but sharper. Who gets to say what's feasible? The silence that followed wasn't passive, it was shaken. Like everyone in the room suddenly remembered that legislation isn't just passion, it's precision. And in this case, precision had been replaced by permission. AOC didn't react visibly, but something in her chest tightened, because she knew where this was going. She'd fought for that clause. She'd seen it survive committee edits. She knew it wasn't perfect, but no clause ever was in a bill this ambitious. But now Kennedy had found the chink in the armor, and he wasn't mocking it. He was using it like a spotlight. Because, Madam Congresswoman, he continued, if I were a laid-off refinery worker reading this, I wouldn't hear a promise. I'd hear a maybe, with a deadline that no one bothered to write. Someone in the back of the room exhaled audibly. It sounded like frustration, or realization. Maybe both. AOC reached for her mic. Calm, composed, but slower than usual. She knew she couldn't deflect. Not here. Not now. She chose her words carefully. The phrase, where appropriate and feasible, exists to provide implementation flexibility across varying economic conditions. Not every solution fits every state, and local input matters. Kennedy didn't interrupt. He just waited, then leaned in slightly. So what you're saying is, it's optional. That stopped her, for just a second. No, she replied. It's conditional, based on coordination and available funding, which means it's not binding, he said, voice still calm. Which means we can say we're supporting workers without ever having to prove it. It wasn't a gotcha moment, it was a reality check. Because what Kennedy had done wasn't attack the climate proposal. He'd done something far more dangerous. He'd revealed its vulnerability to inaction. A bill full of vision, but light on guarantees. And he'd done it not with anger, but with logic so sharp it sounded compassionate. AOC closed the document in front of her. Her hands didn't tremble, her voice didn't crack, but her tone changed. We are in a moral emergency, Senator. We are drafting the future in real time. And when you write in real time, some lines still need to be filled. It was honest, unfiltered, and it hit differently. But Kennedy didn't let go. Then let's fill them. With deadlines, with guarantees, with language that doesn't let someone in a control room in West Virginia become a statistic while we argue definitions. The room responded to that, not with applause, but with tension that shifted toward momentum. AOC didn't see it as a loss. She saw it as a warning. She'd built a proposal around justice, transformation, urgency. But Kennedy had just reminded her, and the country, that justice doesn't live in intentions. It lives in delivery. And the truth was brutal. Section 4B gave the system too much room to disappear. If we fail to fund the future, she said quietly, we're not just failing the climate, we're failing trust. That wasn't just rhetoric, it was reflection. The hearing didn't erupt, it settled, like a courtroom after cross-examination. Everyone now understood. The bill was brilliant, but unfinished. Ambitious, but fragile. And Kennedy? He didn't have to oppose it. He just had to point out what was missing, and in doing so, he reframed the debate, from climate policy to contractual clarity. One clause, one phrase, One sentence that had survived markup meetings and inter-party negotiation was now the fault line on which the rest of the bill teetered. And AOC knew if she wanted to carry this forward, she couldn't just defend the language. She'd have to rewrite it. Because in politics, power doesn't come from what you say. It comes from what you're forced to clarify under pressure. And this was pressure with the whole country watching. For the first time that morning, AOC didn't reach for her mic immediately. She just sat there, silent, not in retreat, but in recognition. Something had landed, not a hit, not a wound. Something deeper, a realization. Kennedy hadn't dismantled her plan. He'd exposed its weak hinge, the part of every ambitious vision that trembles when reality knocks too hard. The vague clause, the soft language, the someday promise written in ink that fades when budgets tighten. The room could feel it, not tension now, but respect, because moments like this separate performance from principle. And AOC didn't blink. She absorbed, then moved. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned forward. Not every blueprint is complete, she said, but the planet won't wait for perfection. It wasn't a defense. It was an acknowledgement. And somehow that honesty hit harder than defiance. Because in a city obsessed with posturing, she'd chosen transparency over pride. We've spent decades saying, wait for the right moment, wait for the right vote, wait for the right president. And while we waited, people drowned, crops died, and neighborhoods disappeared. She paused. So yes, some parts of this bill are still open to improvement, but don't mistake that for weakness. It means we're still listening. There it was, the pivot, from holding the line to opening the door. Even Kennedy didn't interrupt. He just watched, measured, steady, but with something new in his eyes, not triumph, not condescension, something closer to respect earned through resistance. If you're offering to help us fix this, she said, looking directly at him, then let's fix it. That turned heads. One aide in the back sat up, stunned. A journalist from the Washington Post raised an eyebrow and jotted down 3 words. She invited him because this wasn't normal. This wasn't expected. This was leadership, raw, unscripted, risky, and that made it viral before the clip had even finished filming. AOC opened her red folder again. Her fingers moved across a tab labeled Phase 2, Labor Impact. She tapped it once, then looked up. I have names too, Senator. Not just projections. Single moms working night shifts at solar farms, wind tech apprentices who used to be long-haul truckers, a former coal miner who now teaches battery storage engineering in Pennsylvania. She paused. But I know, for every one of those, there's someone we missed. And there it was again. The tension not in conflict, but in growth. The hearing wasn't about defeat anymore. It was about transformation under pressure. So here's the deal, she said. If the phrase, where appropriate and feasible, doesn't protect the people it's supposed to, then we rewrite it. Gasps. One senator whispered something to an aide. Another leaned back, calculating the political math. Because this wasn't just a rhetorical shift. This was policy evolution happening live. Kennedy leaned into his mic, calm, careful. Then let's work, not to make it sound better, to make it stand up. And for the first time since the hearing began, there was no fire, no frost, just forward motion. AOC nodded once, not smiling, still locked in, but no longer cornered. She had chosen the only path that made sense when conviction meets critique, adaptation without surrender. I didn't come here to protect language, I came here to protect people. And if it takes new words to do that, I'll write them with anyone who's willing. The room breathed again, because that kind of statement doesn't come from weakness. It comes from ownership, the kind that says, I built this, and I'll rebuild it stronger. Kennedy sat back slightly. The folder in front of him remained closed. He didn't need to press further. He'd made his point, and she had made hers. But now, for the first time, they were speaking on the same page. The moderators exchanged glances. The cameras held steady. The hashtags were already being drafted, but none of them knew what to call it, because it wasn't a takedown. It wasn't a collapse. It was a shift. The kind of shift that moves policy from paper to people. And it all began the moment she didn't retreat, but chose to pivot, chose to listen, chose to answer not with defense, but with direction. The moment the hearing recessed for lunch, the hallway outside Committee Room 216 turned into a battlefield of whispers and clattering heels. But AOC didn't stop to greet reporters or wave to cameras. She moved swiftly, not out of fear, but calculation, her team trailing behind her like anxious shadows. The door to the side room clicked shut. Instantly, the calm evaporated. "Congresswoman, you gave him oxygen. You let him reframe the conversation. That pivot, it's trending, but not in the way we want. We should issue a statement now, draw a red line. We have less than 2 hours before the headlines lock." The words collided like debris in a storm. Her comms director was pacing. One aide had their phone up, scrolling through a barrage of tweets. Another was drafting a rebuttal, the words false equivalence already typed in bold. But AOC stood still, not defensive, not rattled, present. In the center of the chaos, she breathed, slow, steady, like she had already played this out in her mind before anyone else had even noticed the wind shifting. Then finally she spoke. "He didn't attack the plan," she said, voice calm but unshakable. "He attacked the silence inside it." That froze them. And he's not wrong. You could hear the collective inhale. One aide stopped mid-swipe. The policy advisor furrowed his brow, unsure if she was admitting fault or setting a new bar. But she clarified before anyone dared object. "Every proposal has a heartbeat. If there's a section where that heartbeat skips, where we talk around the people we claim to protect, then we fix it." Someone exhaled sharply, frustrated. "But you can't say he's right, Congresswoman. He called you out." AOC turned. "No, he called us in." The room fell quiet, because in that moment, it wasn't about strategy, it was about ethics, about something deeper than party lines and viral clips. It was about the very reason they'd stayed up for 16-hour drafting sessions and fought for every footnote in that climate bill. To serve real people, not just win headlines. She walked over to the whiteboard on the far wall, grabbed a marker, and underlined a section from the rollout plan. Job transition pathways, rural phase. This is where he struck. They knew she was right. That clause had been rushed. Its language softened in last-minute negotiations. They had focused on innovation zones, energy credits, infrastructure banks. But not once, had they drilled down into what would happen to the welder in West Virginia who couldn't code, who didn't want to move, who didn't understand what green jobs even meant. "We speak of justice," she said, turning back, "but we forgot to speak to the ones most afraid of what justice will require." The words didn't scold. They charged the air with clarity. Her chief strategist sat down, rubbing his forehead. "We can't walk this back. It's out there." She nodded. "Then we don't walk it back. We walk through it." They looked at her, not as a politician, but as a leader. And that's when the fire shifted direction. "We build a new clause. Today, we name towns, we name jobs, we name people." An intern whispered, "Names like Kennedy did?" AOC didn't flinch. Exactly like Kennedy did. And there it was. The real moment of strategy. Not to erase the confrontation, but to expand the conversation. To show the nation that when challenged, they didn't hide behind talking points. They rewrote the damn blueprint. Someone pulled up the list of testimonial letters they'd set aside weeks ago. Voices from Appalachia, Native communities, out-of-work factory workers in Indiana. Letters they hadn't spotlighted because they didn't fit the rollout narrative. Now they did, because now the narrative had changed, and AOC wasn't here to protect ego. She was here to protect impact. "We're not backing down," she said, uncapping a red pen. "We're digging deeper." The aides began shifting in tone. Phones were no longer doom scrolling. Laptops opened. Strategy turned from panic to planning. They weren't chasing damage control. They were building narrative control. "If he wanted a hearing," she said with quiet fire, "I'll give him one." She looked at the intern holding a draft of the statement. "But tell the press we're revising with him, Because if the future's on fire, I don't care who helps carry the water, as long as we get the flames out. There it was, the line. AOC had turned what looked like a tactical loss into a movement moment. And behind that closed door, her team finally saw what the public would soon learn. Strength isn't in always being right. It's in being ready to evolve and bring others with you. The chamber was quieter than the day before, but no less electric. As the staffers arranged fresh pitchers of water and checked mic levels, there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there 24 hours earlier. Something had shifted, not in noise, but in weight. Yesterday was fire. Today might be fuel. Then the door creaked open. Senator John Kennedy stepped in alone. No aides, no photographers trailing him. Just a single brown leather briefcase in hand and a slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. No nods, no posturing. He headed straight to the clerk's desk like he'd done it 1,000 times before, but this time with something new in his possession. He handed over a single sheet of paper, his tone low, barely above a whisper. "I'd like this amendment entered for the record," he said. The clerk glanced at it, then read it again. The change was surgical, but it might as well have been dynamite. It replaced 7 words, from "where appropriate and feasible" to "shall provide direct funding within 6 months." That was it. No speech, no smirk, no grandstanding. Just that one page. Kennedy quietly returned to his seat, adjusted his glasses, and folded his hands. No staff behind him, no cameras on him. But in the back row, a journalist dropped her pen. She understood what just happened, and if the others didn't yet, they would soon. Because that one change didn't just modify the bill, it committed to it. AOC entered 5 minutes later. She clocked the shift in the room immediately. The temperature was different. People weren't bracing for a clash anymore. They were listening. As she walked past Kennedy's desk, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but something deeper passed between them. Recognition, not of agreement, but of respect. Chairwoman Sanderson called the hearing to order. Voices murmured as copies of the amendment circulated. There was confusion, then realization, then silence. The room was still processing the nerve of what Kennedy had done. He hadn't rebutted AOC's climate vision. He'd refined it, strengthened it, grounded it, and in doing so, he'd taken the abstract and forced it into a ticking clock. 6 months. No loopholes. No delays. When the floor opened, no one spoke at first, until AOC leaned forward and, with a calm but commanding tone, addressed the room. Yesterday, we debated urgency. Today, we were handed a stopwatch. Eyes turned to her. And let me be crystal clear, this amendment isn't a concession. It's a challenge. To us, to the system, to me. It doesn't weaken the bill. It dares it to deliver. Some aides raised their eyebrows. That wasn't scripted, but AOC didn't need a script. She was speaking from a place only pressure can unlock. Senator Kennedy has drawn a line in the sand, not to divide us, but to demand action from all of us. Gasps rippled, not because she was surrendering, but because she was evolving in real time. Her tone wasn't performative. It was policy-making as moral clarity. She paused, scanning the room. You asked who decides what's appropriate. You asked who defines feasible. Now we have an answer. The people waiting for help, and the clock we just set. Her words didn't just honor the amendment, they elevated it. At the back, someone clapped once, hesitant, then another, then a staffer, then a journalist. And within seconds, the room that had once held only tension began to hum with something rarer. Momentum. Even Sanderson looked stunned. Not because she hadn't seen compromises before, but because this wasn't compromise. This was co-authorship. AOC nodded once to Kennedy. Kennedy returned the gesture. Barely, but enough. Because this wasn't a performance anymore. It was policy as theater, and integrity as script. That afternoon, the clip went viral, not of shouting, not of takedowns, but of AOC saying, "Justice doesn't fear deadlines, it demands them," and of Kennedy's amendment being read into the record, as the moment that a divided room remembered why the public still watches politics, not just for power plays, but for glimpses of what courage looks like when it wears different colors, but fights the same fire. The most dangerous blow is not a scream, it's a precise silence. It was just a line, a silent edit. No cameras were rolling, no reporters were paying attention. But to those in power, it was like a siren before a political storm. The next morning, while the press was still buzzing about yesterday's drama between AOC and Kennedy deep inside the Capitol, legislative advisors were sweating. What did Kennedy do? He quietly filed an amendment, just 6 words. But they were 6 words that could detonate a policy bomb. Shall provide direct funding within 6 months. No more, where feasible. No more, if conditions permit. No more, way out of the loop. Just one thing, mandatory, 6 months. No delay, no escape. In AOC's office, a quiet earthquake was brewing. Kayla, AOC's chief counsel, threw the printout down on the table. Oh my God, he's not playing politics. He just made us keep every promise. Luis, the data analyst, stared at the screen. He's not undermining her. He's planting a mine right in her proposal. A young recruit, Amara, spoke quietly from the corner, her voice trembling but firm. He's not undermining her. He's making her do what she says she'll do. The room froze. No one objected. No one breathed. Meanwhile, in the back rooms of the government, the senior advisors began pounding on the table. This was no longer a symbolic proposal. Kennedy had turned it into a fanged pledge, and if it passed, billions of dollars would be forced to be spent, not just empty promises. The phones rang. Lobbyists rushed in. People who had dismissed AOC as a drama were now asking, is she really going to do it? Upstairs, AOC sat brooding in front of the glass doors, not speaking, not fighting back, not defending. He didn't yell at me, she whispered. He read the silence in my proposal. Kayla stepped forward. Do you want to fight back? AOC turned. Her eyes were no longer angry. They were sharp. No, I don't need to fight back. I need to answer him with real action. Lewis picked up his laptop. We can rewrite the proposal, he said. Amara interrupted. No, let's make that amendment the headline. The room fell silent. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, an internal memo from AOC's office was sent to all the environmental coalitions and key constituents. The headline was simple but powerful. Leadership isn't about shouting the loudest. It's about saying, I can do better. The memo didn't just spread across social media. It reshaped how people viewed AOC. She didn't fall. She didn't lose credibility. She turned Kennedy's silent stab into her own sword. In a 36-second TikTok, AOC stood before Congress. No notes, no aides, just her clear voice. I used to think you had to speak loudly to be heard. But today I learned, sometimes you have to listen deeply to know what's missing. The video reached 12 million views in 18 hours. But that number is not as important as the change that is brewing in America. No cameras, no microphones, no aides. Just a half-closed wooden door, and a decision that hit the air like lightning in the middle of Washington's storm. AOC stepped into Kennedy's office. No appointment, no press release. She wasn't there to make small talk. She came to seal a strategy. And for the first time in this saga, her voice wasn't there to confront. It was there to reconstruct. If we're doing this, then we're doing it right. No theatrics, no flowery words, but every syllable hit like a gavel. Kennedy, the man she once accused of dragging the wheels of justice, didn't flinch. He just nodded once. Clause by clause. No one outside knew the meeting was happening, but if some rogue reporter had managed to slip a recorder beneath that desk, they wouldn't have found a shouting match for the headlines. They would have discovered something rarer. Politics in its rawest form. Highlighters cutting through ink. Her voice reading every legal phrase aloud. Sometimes arguing over a comma. He broke down federal funding mechanisms. She pressed on racial equity clauses. It wasn't negotiation. It was open-heart surgery on a policy long paralyzed. Then in a rare lull, Kennedy asked, "Why'd you come back?" After all that, AOC set her pen down. Didn't look at him. Her eyes scanned the window. Past the monuments, past the headlines, toward the people they both claimed to fight for. Because I'm tired of screaming into microphones, hoping someone actually hears me. I want something that outlasts a hashtag. Silence. Not what he expected, but exactly what he needed to hear. Moments later, they were locked in battle over a line about regional grant distribution. AOC demanded equity for all states, no matter color or income. Kennedy insisted some regions needed special treatment because they'd been shafted for decades. Voices rose, not out of anger, but out of fierce care. Then AOC slammed her palm on the table, not in rage, but in clarity. Then say it, write it down. No state left behind, no community labeled acceptable loss. Kennedy nodded, opened his laptop, and for the first time, they co-wrote a future. Outside, reporters were still buzzing. Is AOC going to clap back? Is Kennedy trying to steal her moment? They had it all wrong, because the two inside weren't fighting for spotlight. They were building something the spotlight rarely sees. In that empty office beneath the late-day DC sun, a red pen lay across a document marked Revised Climate Equity Proposal. Draft 3. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't perfect, but it had fingerprints from both sides of the aisle. And in a city frozen by division, that was a miracle. Theirs wasn't a story that ended with applause. There were no thunderous tweets, no viral headlines. It ended with a nod, a promise, and one handwritten line at the bottom of the page. They weren't negotiating for headlines. They were rebuilding the bridge that policy forgot. The phones lit up like fire alarms. Not congratulations, warnings. From the left, you're making him look bipartisan. That's dangerous. From the right, don't think this makes you a hero. It makes you vulnerable. Chiefs of staff spoke in hushed fury. Caucus leaders sharpened their talking points. But none of the outrage was about the bill. It was about the optics. And optics in D.C. weigh heavier than outcomes. AOC sat with the phone still warm in her hand. The message was clear. Fall back, be predictable, stick to the narrative. Kennedy got his version too, sharper, colder. One advisor didn't mince words. You don't belong in her storyline, and she sure as hell doesn't belong in yours. But neither of them flinched, because while party leaders feared the headlines, the people outside the Beltway were reading something else entirely. Finally, someone dared to break the script. No press release, no dramatic vote, just one quiet email at midnight. Amendment A-17 temporarily removed from docket, pending further review. No explanation, just procedural fog, the kind used to bury things no one wants to kill out loud. Kennedy didn't storm the press. He didn't tweet outrage. He went to work. One by one, he reached out to labor unions, school board reps, rural water networks, anyone who'd actually be impacted by the change. Don't trust me, he told them. Just read it, then decide. Meanwhile, AOC made no public statement, but behind the scenes, her team began quietly circulating a summary. Annotated, translated, simplified for community groups. It didn't scream rebellion. It whispered readiness. In Washington, delay is often defeat in disguise, but not this time. Because while others saw a setback, they saw a chance. Let them stall the bill. They couldn't stall the momentum. The video was only 47 seconds long. A town hall, a folding chair, fluorescent lights overhead. A man, middle-aged, dusty denim, steelworker's hands, stood up with the amendment printed in crumpled paper. His voice cracked, but his eyes didn't blink. I don't care who wrote it. I don't care what party they're from. Someone finally wrote me in. The room fell silent, then broke into applause. Not polite, but raw, unfiltered. The kind that says, we've been waiting too damn long to matter. Within hours, the clip spread like wildfire. Teachers shared it. Veterans reposted it. A former coal miner stitched it with a single caption. This is what policy's supposed to sound like. Cable news ignored it, but TikTok didn't. Reddit didn't. Facebook moms and factory dads didn't. And somewhere in a Capitol office, AOC watched it quietly. She didn't smile. She nodded. Because she knew the amendment might have been pulled from the docket, but it had just been written into the American bloodstream. The doors opened not with a roar, but with a silence so sharp it cut through expectation. The chamber filled slowly. No banners, no buzz, no media frenzy. just breathe, just gravity, just the kind of tension that said, "Something's about to break," staffers whispered. Reporters watched. Some expected AOC to grandstand. Others braced for collapse. Instead, she stood. No podium, no theatrics. Just a woman in a dark blazer and worn-down heels, rising like she'd done this 1,000 times. Because she had. She didn't deliver a speech. She didn't scan the room for applause. She said 8 words. 8 words that ricocheted across the marble floor and landed in every heart that had ever been overlooked by Washington. This amendment won't fix everything, but it will fix being forgotten. The words didn't need volume. They needed truth. And truth, when spoken without armor, hits harder than any insult. For once, even her critics didn't interrupt. Not because they agreed, but because they understood. Because somewhere beneath their partisan posturing, they remembered. Policy isn't poetry. It's oxygen, and people are suffocating. The room didn't erupt. It inhaled, because it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about mattering. No slogans, no sound bites. Just the quiet rebellion of a congresswoman who refused to let broken systems stay broken in silence. And in that moment, AOC wasn't just speaking for progressives or for climate. She was speaking for anyone who'd ever watched lawmakers argue for hours and still leave them off the page. The chamber was holding its breath. Phones paused. Laptops froze mid-type. And then, he stood. Senator Kennedy, the very man who had once dismantled AOC's phrasing line by line, now reached for the microphone, not with fire, but with something heavier. "Wait. I may never agree with every line in her plan," he began, his southern drawl cutting through the stillness like a gavel across marble. "But I know what it's like to sit at a kitchen table and wonder if your job will still be there in 6 months. I know what it's like to hear promises in D.C. and feel like they were spoken in another language." He turned, not to AOC, but to the gallery, where aides and janitors stood shoulder to shoulder with climate activists and skeptical union reps. "I'll argue policy till I'm hoarse," he continued, "but I'll defend the people who have to live through it, because they're not pawns in a talking point. They're the ones holding up the roof." AOC didn't speak. She didn't need to. For once, she was the audience, and her eyes said everything. Respect isn't about agreement. It's about allegiance to truth. The vote was called. It didn't pass with fanfare or balloons, but it passed with grit, with numbers that made pundits double-check their screens. Not unanimously, but strongly, not perfectly, but powerfully. And in that moment, in the click of green lights and hushed disbelief, something shifted. The floor wasn't just marble anymore. It was ground reclaimed, not for politics, but for people. The next morning, the story exploded, not with fire, but with heat. News anchors traded their usual bite for something softer, almost reverent. MSNBC opened with, "Unlikely unity in a fractured chamber." Fox News, unusually restrained, ran a banner that read, "Kennedy and AOC find common ground in policy." No exclamation point, just fact. And that silence spoke louder than any headline. But it wasn't what the pundits said. It was who started quoting it. A welding foreman in Pittsburgh pulled off his gloves and told his crew, "They finally wrote us in." A science teacher in Phoenix used it as her lesson opener. Policy doesn't start in a hearing. It starts when someone feels heard. A black trucker on a long-haul route live-streamed his take. "I don't care what party they're from. If they're fixing real things, that's my kind of politics." His video hit 1 million views in 2 hours. The hashtags shifted from hashtag Green New Deal War to hashtag Right Using and hashtag Clause by Clause. People weren't just watching politics. They were feeling it. And quietly, something more radical happened. Workers began printing out the amendment, highlighting it, passing it across lunch counters and break rooms. Not to dissect it, but to own it. For the first time in years, policy didn't feel like an ivory tower experiment. It felt like a blueprint signed by calloused hands. Because this time, the welders and the teachers didn't just vote. They were the footnotes, the proof, the purpose. The door was closed. The lights were dim. Just a small desk lamp lit the corner of her office. Enough for a pen, a notebook, and a woman who had just come through political war and walked out changed. No staff, no photographers, no applause, just silence and a page. AOC sat still for a long moment. Her hands were steady, but her eyes flickered with the weight of something she rarely allowed to show. The cost of doing it her way. She'd been praised for passion, mocked for boldness, studied like a specimen. But what the headlines never captured, not once, was the aftermath. The moment the fire dies down and you're left with a simple, impossible question, did it actually matter? She opened her notebook. At the top of a clean page, she didn't write a policy proposal or a punchline or a quote made for Twitter. She wrote a sentence that was meant for no one's ears but her own. You don't prove leadership by shouting, you prove it by writing people into the future. She stared at the words, read them twice, then underlined writing people into the future. This wasn't about winning the room, or burying Kennedy, or holding the perfect clapback. It was about the trucker in Ohio who hadn't had work in 2 months, the teacher in Arizona buying markers with her own paycheck, the single mom in Brooklyn watching the water rise outside her basement window and wondering what carbon offset even meant. They didn't care about applause. They cared about action. She thought about the early days, when being the outsider was the armor, when every speech was a torch and every vote was a declaration. But now, something had shifted. Kennedy hadn't changed her mind. He'd forced her to expand it. Real power, she realized, wasn't volume. It was vision, wide enough to see even those who don't scream for it. She flipped to the next page and scribbled a line that wasn't meant for policy, but maybe should be. We rise by reaching back. She paused again, looked toward the window. The Capitol dome glowed under the evening sky. Proud, distant, unfinished. Like the country it served. There was still a fight ahead. There would be more hearings, more backlash, more moments where she'd be told to sit down, shut up, fall in line. But tonight, she wasn't planning a rebuttal. She was writing a blueprint. The marble hallway was almost empty. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm. Or maybe just after history happens. No press, no staffers, no interns pretending not to listen with their phones on standby. Just two people. Two names the media once pitted like fire and water. AOC walking out of a budget subcommittee. Kennedy heading toward an elevator. They noticed each other a second too late to pretend they didn't. She stopped. So did he. The silence wasn't awkward, it was earned. She tilted her head, a half smile tugging at the edge of her expression. Then almost playfully but not without bite. Next time, let's skip the insult. It wasn't a jab, it was an invitation. He didn't blink, just offered that slow southern grin that had once concealed sharpness. But now maybe carried something closer to respect. Next time, let's skip the delay. And there it was. No need for applause. No cameras to spin it. No tweets to trend it. Just truth, spoken plain between adversaries turned architects. She stepped forward, lowered her voice like she was talking to an old rival she'd finally learned to spar with, not against. They thought this was about a bill. He nodded almost to himself. It never was. They stood in silence again, but this time it was different. Less like tension, more like gravity. The kind of pull you feel when you realize you both want the same thing, and are finally brave enough to admit it out loud. Then before she turned to leave, AOC added something that wasn't for headlines, wasn't for strategy, but maybe for legacy. We don't make this the new standard, they'll turn it back into noise. Kennedy's answer came not with words, but with a hand over his chest and the kind of nod that says, I heard that. All of it. As she disappeared down one corridor and he down another, the echo of their final words hung in the air. Not dramatic, but decisive. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of how things could be done when courage outran ego. Over quiet scenes of workers reading headlines, students debating the hearing in civics class, a man in overalls leans on his lunchbox, eyes scanning a front-page headline that bears her name. A teenage girl flips through a textbook that, until now, never mentioned anyone who looked or sounded like her. In a civics classroom, 3 states away, 2 students argue. Not about scandal, not about sound bites, but about amendments, language, representation. A janitor turns up the volume on the break room TV. A retired nurse posts a clip of the town hall with the caption, "This one hit home." No explosions, no gavel slams, just ripple after ripple of people realizing they were never supposed to be extras in this story. They were always the authors. They just needed someone to hand them the pen. The screen fades from headline to hallway, from student to steelworker, from protest to quiet resolve. Over it all, her voice begins. Not loud, not angry, just steady, measured, like someone who has walked through fire and come out choosing to build instead of burn. I didn't change my mind, I changed my method, because shouting gets attention, but building gets results. Because if the future isn't built for everyone, it will fail for everyone. And because every time they tried to write us out, we found a way to write ourselves in. The final images unfold. AOC sitting quietly, watching the vote tally roll in. No fist pump, no tears, just the hint of a nod. The kind that says this wasn't the finish line. It was the first brick. In another city, a young woman tapes a printout of the amendment to her dorm wall. In a rural diner, 2 elderly veterans sit in silence until one mutters, "Finally." Across the country, the debate has shifted, not ended, but shifted, away from spectacle and towards substance. The camera zooms slowly out from the Capitol dome at dusk, the sun hitting the flag just right. Not for patriotism, but for promise. There's something rare, almost revolutionary, about watching 2 lawmakers who were supposed to be enemies rewrite the narrative. Not through speeches or sound bites, but through quiet, principled action. AOC and Kennedy didn't just draft an amendment, they shattered a myth that bipartisanship must mean compromise of values or silence in the face of injustice. Instead, they showed us something more radical, collaboration with conviction. The emotional high wasn't in the vote tally, it was in the factory worker holding a crumpled printout saying, "Someone finally wrote me in." That moment, that's what democracy is supposed to feel like. Not distant, not transactional, but alive, raw, and deeply human. We talk so much about politics in terms of power, but what if we reframed it as representation with responsibility? This story reminded me that leadership isn't about dominating the room, it's about who you're willing to listen to when no one's watching. And sometimes courage sounds less like shouting and more like standing beside someone you were told to avoid. So let me ask you, who have you written off that maybe, just maybe, could help you write something better? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.